from the actual experiment to try to synthesize granite. That's a fine-grained rock, just like the rhyolite that we just saw. There's no difference. There it is. And so I showed the whole audience that night. I said, this is the answer to what we're talking about tonight. Granite does not reform as a result of the cooling of a melt over a long period of time under pressure and so forth. I said, here is the original granite. And here is what comes out of the experiment. There's no resemblance. And remember this, that in the original granite, there are these primordial polonium halos. Guess what happens when granite is melted? And granite is melted and resolidifies like this, or like this piece of rhyolite. There are no halos whatsoever. The work of creation is gone completely. So 22 years down the road now, 22 years down the road, no one has responded. Not only that, but I spoke at the University of Tennessee, again, just a year and a half ago, and I advertised a full-page ad in the Knoxville News Sentinel indicating I was going to be speaking at the University of Tennessee again, and I invited everybody in the city of Knoxville, Tennessee to come, and also I put ads in the Daily Beacon, the student newspaper of the University of Tennessee, to especially inform the students and all the faculty I was going to be there again, so that if they wanted to start the warfare all over again, or the controversy, or if they had the answer, there they were going to have their opportunity. April 9 last year, guess what? I went and I spoke again. How many faculty members were there this time? None. How many students were there as a cheering section? There was one lone student sitting over there in the distance. He didn't say anything. What I'm saying is this is far, far down the road of the God of heaven helping us all to understand. We're dealing with experimental facts that affirm the Genesis record of creation, what God said. So, we'll continue. What I'm saying tonight is also in the book Creation of Tiny Mystery. It's all online if you'd like to read it, halos.com. So we see why the evolutionary theory of an Earth slowly cooled from a hot molten ball over billions of years has never been a valid scientific theory. Best can be compared to the Ptolemaic cosmology debacle. Remember, Ptolemy had the idea that indeed the planets were circling what? The Earth, and the sun was circling the Earth. It was that bad. And it's that bad even today. Nevertheless, the crucial question is, what is the response of the worldwide scientific community been to the primordial polonium halo evidence for creation? And in the decade before the trial in Arkansas, I was a visiting scientist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and was able to publish a number of scientific papers about this, what we're talking about tonight, in the world's leading scientific journals. David, you want to help us review this?
Yeah, somebody last night was talking to me and saying, exactly what was said in the scientific reports. And I said, well, we'll be bringing out quotations from those. But the stories behind the publication of these reports are actually more interesting, just as interesting as the evidence themselves, because it really focuses your attention on the fact that each published report has a miracle story behind how it got published. In fact, some of the wording from the reports still was able to contain enough information to raise eyebrows. For instance, in Nature, the 1973 report, the phrase that was taken from this report says the half-lives of the polonium isotopes, approximately 3 minutes for polonium-218, are too short to permit anything but a rapid mineral crystallization, contrary to accepted theories of magmatic cooling rates. So, in scientific lingo, that's saying, what's accepted is over here, but this is what we have. It's contrary to that. There's some more quotations here, I think.
I want to focus on this just a second. Nature, of course, the editor of Nature magazine at that time and still today, they're evolutionists, strong evolutionists. Not only that, but these papers that I've sent in for publication, they went out to strong evolutionists for review. They had to be peer-reviewed before they were okayed for publication. And this statement that I put in there is, David said, in scientific lingo, that means that indeed we're We're talking about too short to permit anything but a rapid crystallization. The scientists who read that understood that what we were saying is that the granite rocks had to cool rapidly. Now, they would not, and I may get into have the opportunity here after a while of telling you just a little bit about God's great providence and interacting with some of the editors and the scientists themselves about these results. It's fascinating. As David has said, God's hand was behind the scene all the time that was sending these papers in for publication. But anyway,
tell them, just since you said that, you can just tell them one brief incident where the reviewer asked you, what are you getting at here? So you just have to briefly say that tell them that one little story.
You dared to open the door for me to talk about this briefly?
I'll tell you what, I'll let you do that if you let me have that clicker.
Well, I believe, we ask for the Lord to lead and guide, and so I think David has asked a question that needs to be answered briefly. And when I was very early starting out, and sending these papers in for publication, I sent one in to the journal Science, their headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the editor, was frowning at me because he saw that indeed what I was sending in for publication was contrary to what he thought was the truth, because he was a professional geologist as well as the associate editor of the magazine. But anyway, he sent my paper out for review, and it came back. The review came back, and normally a review of my scientific papers will never have the reviewer's name on them. But this one did. The reviewer said, I want to talk to you. What in this world are you talking about? So I immediately called him up. And the first thing he said, told him who I was and so forth, he said, yeah, I know who you are. I want to know, what is it you're talking about in this paper? And I said, I'm going to be up front with you. I say, I think these polonium radiohalos are evidence of fiat creation. Now, he could have hung up on me, slammed the phone, and said all sorts of negative things. But he said, my grandfather was a Methodist minister. But anyway, after that introduction, he said, what about this? What about this? What about this? More and more technical aspects of the paper. And I answered them. And I said, well, what can we do? I still want to get this paper published. And so he said, well, I tell you what, I want you to do this experiment, this experiment, this experiment, this experiment, and then, send the paper in for publication again, and I'll take another look at it. I did all of that. And then when I finished that, I called him. He was at Carnegie Mellon University. And I said, I finished, I've written the paper and so forth, getting ready to send it in for publication. But before I do that, I want to let you take a look at it. So I flew up to Pittsburgh. He picked me up. This world-renowned evolutionist picked me up, took me to his office there at Carnegie Mellon University. We went over the paper, sentence by paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, word by word, and comma by comma, and period by period, the whole day. At the end of the day, he said, there's something here I don't understand. But on the way back, he took me back to the airport that night, catch a plane back to Washington, D.C. He said, and I told him, again, we discussed God actually having these in the rocks to provide evidence of creation. But he said, oh, listen, Bob, I want to tell you, if you say anything about God doing this or God responsible for these halos, I'm going to slam the door. I won't have the paper published, just like that. So anyway, I went back, revised it a little bit again according to his other suggestions, sent it in for publication, and waited and waited and waited and waited and waited, and called, and the editor and said, the paper has not come in from this scientist there. And I got very well acquainted with this evolutionist editor there at Science Magazine. And he got to know me very well. We went out to eat together with my wife and a friend of ours there. Can you imagine that? Big-time evolutionist, associate editor of the paper, me, a creationist, believing the earth is 6,000 years old. But he sees the weight of the evidence as such. What is he going to do? He sends it out for review, and these people can't turn it over, can't turn it down. They can't overthrow it. And anyway, got to the point it was still waiting for his final review in order to get the paper published. It never came in. And finally, I called one day at the office after I'd been calling for months. I said, what's happened to my paper? And I asked for the editor, and they said, oh, the editor, he's in the hospital. My heart sank. I said, oh, no, this man's been trying to help me to get this paper published for a year, and now he's in the hospital. And I said, do you know where it is? They looked and looked, and they said, we can't find it. I said, it's got to be there somewhere. And they said, well, wait a minute, we'll look one more place. He came back and said, I found it. I said, where is it? It's on the copy editor's desk. The copy editor's desk? Yeah, it's been approved for publication. It's going to be published here in just a few weeks. I can't go on, but anyway, I will go on. I will go on, because after I got the paper back and I had the final review copy and ready to, the printed copy ready to go in for publication, the editorial copy, I decided to take it back down to the editor and thank him for the fact that indeed he had done so much to help to get the paper published. Went down to see him, sat down and was talking to him there in his office there in Science in downtown Washington, D.C. And he said, Bob, you know, he got out of the hospital. He said, Bob, whatever happened to that paper we had in for publication? I said, John, you don't know. Here's the paper right here. I've got it. It's the copy edited version. It's ready to be published. His face turned pale. He thought, what in the world have I done? Anyway, he said, let me have the paper. I went back home, Pat and I prayed earnestly that God would not let this man back out after all that. And he didn't. The paper was published. It's in the back of my book. Anyway, David, that's what you did in opening that door for me to say something. We could go on and on, but...
Well, I think it's important, you know, part of what we're trying to do is establish credibility for what we're saying. And I don't care who you talk to, where they're from, who they work for, where they went to school, it doesn't make any difference. Do they have published scientific reports refuting this evidence? And I can tell you right now, the answer is no, they don't. So they can complain and they can cry all they want about how they don't believe the polonium halos evidence, this or that. But ask them one simple question. What papers have you published to refute that evidence? And the answer is going to be very simple. None. And not only that, the papers that the magazines where these papers were originally published was not the Review and Herald. It wasn't, you know, Ministry Magazine.
Signs of the Times.
Signs of the Times or whatever. It was, you know, the world's premier scientific journals. So to try to take pot shots at the evidence for creation without backing it up with your own published work, to me is not sound. It doesn't make sense. So that's why I think it is important. And yes, when you do look at some of the stories behind how the papers originally got published, to me it only adds more credibility to the story which we're trying to build, and that is basically God really did leave something in the rocks as evidence of His creative power. And you can go to the Bible and you can read the Bible and you can see that what we're saying matches what you read in the Bible. There's no reason why it shouldn't match, because if God left the evidence for creation in the rocks, it's going to match what He has written in the Bible. That's our view of things.
Let's continue. This is what someone else said, again in Science in 1973, that indeed other people were looking at this evidence that I had been publishing, and it says, you know, it was realized very early their existence, meaning the polonium halos, would cause apparently insuperable geological problems since the relevant polonium half-life is of the order of minutes. In other words, they recognize that indeed, if you have them there at all, then it's going to demand something being crystallized, the granites being crystallized very, very, very rapidly. Then, of course, here's another statement from my other paper there in Nature, David.
In this article and in this publication in Nature, the phrase is added, do polonium halos imply that unknown processes were operative during the formative period of the Earth? Is it possible that polonium halos in Precambrian rocks represent extinct natural radioactivity, primordial, and are therefore of cosmological significance?
Now that cosmological significance, see what we were saying is this, whereas people, the geologists, astronomers, everyone in the scientific community believes that the Earth came from the remnants of the Big Bang. And so therefore they're saying that the matter of the Earth actually came from exploding stars billions and billions of years ago. So when I say they're cosmological significance, the polonium halos are cosmological significance, what we're saying is, in their language, that indeed we're saying that the matter that supposedly formed in a supernova got over here to the Earth and was cooled in solid form within just a few minutes. That's what it means. That's the essence of what that statement meant. That was the closest I could come to explain to them that we're talking about instant creation of matter, no matter where supposedly it originated. Not only that,